your teacher meeting a survivor of Auschwitz?
Oh, yeah. People will say stuff like, man, you tell all these great stories. You've had like 3 lives. I feel like I have too. But not every story I have is the greatest story of all time. The greatest story of all time isn't my own. It's just something that I happen to be next to. So in between one university to another, I ended up at a community college for a little while. And while I was at this one community college, I took a honors history course on the Holocaust. And my professor, Professor Scott O'Gara, is still near and dear to me to this day. Now, Professor O'Gara, he started the class off with a little bit about what we could expect. And our class started out with like 20 to 30 people. About 2 weeks in, they realized how hard this class was going to be. And a lot of these people were like, oh, I should have chosen mythology for my humanities credit, like something else. And we ended up with like less than 10 people a few weeks later. Well, I'll tell you what those other people missed out on. They missed out on really great instruction from an incredible instructor. But more importantly, this. He tells this story of when he went to Europe to go see a bunch of different sites that were historically important to the Holocaust. And of course, these are the labor camps and then also the death camps related to the Holocaust. One in question, Majdanek, Sobibor, Birkenau, those are like some of the big ones. And he was going to visit Birkenau specifically, which is the main one of the main camps outside of Auschwitz, right? So anyway, he goes there knowing that this place has been razed to the ground. You're talking about just a field nowadays. And to be clear, this story is taking place in the last century, right? So he goes to this spot, he's checking it out, and it's not that there aren't people around, it's a field now. So the people that are around are not there because they're doing research for a history paper or book. But he sees this older man walking around and he asks him, hey, you wouldn't by chance happen to know if this is the spot of this historically important area? And the guy says, actually it is. And I'm here paying my respects. And so it was just weird that 2 people happen to be in this random field at the same time for the same purpose. So Professor O'Gara is like, oh, well, what do you know about it? And the guy's like, I can tell you more than most. And he's like, in what way? He's like, well, I'm one of the survivors. And it's at that point that Professor O'Gara is like, no way, because there were only 2 survivors of this one specific camp. The guy goes, yeah, me and my cousin. Wait, so you're this guy or this guy? And he's like, I'm that one. Turns out to be David Tenenbaum. Now, David Tenenbaum and he end up creating this great rapport, and they start chatting. And next thing you know, they go off and they have a lovely dinner and they're conversing. And it comes out that while this gentleman was going through his whole life story, it is absolutely impressive how they got to that field. And it kind of starts at the end. So right as the Germans were losing and the Russians were coming through the eastern side of Poland, a lot of these camps were emptying and heading back to Germany, or at least in the direction of home base. So as these camps were emptying, some of these Nazi officers were taking groups of people that could be moved, and they were doing these death marches, getting them back away from the lines. Well, this one camp was mostly children at this point. So the officers grab a bunch of these kids and they start marching them through these wooded foothills going back west. As this group is making their march for however long it has taken place so far, they can hear like heavy mechanized things coming over the mountains, maybe tanks, maybe armored vehicles, something like that. But they're unsure of what. But man, the Germans don't want to stick around and stay there. So they're marching these kids as fast as they can. Now the noise is getting closer. So eventually what happens is these officers decide they can't afford to move at the pace of these starved children. So they're going to just off them. And so as they get them down in the prone position, one by one, this officer starts going by and delivering the coup de grace to each one of these kids. He gets to the second to last kid in line, not David Tenenbaum, just some other child. And the kid screams up, God save me. And that apparently was an affront to this German officer. So he takes a few extra moments to beat the child before he kills him. And that extra amount of time was necessary for David Tenenbaum's success because at that right moment, a tank crests the hill and starts accurately supplying fire to the Germans. So now they flee, and so does David Tenenbaum. He runs and he runs and he runs, and he finds this little village in the middle of Poland, and he starts knocking on every door. No one's going to let him in because even though they might not be Nazi sympathizers, they understand that by housing a young Jewish boy at that time could be bad for their health. So not to blame these people, but they just don't want to be involved. So they just keep their doors shut. Eventually he gets to a Catholic church and he knocks on the door and it just opens and he goes inside. And this young Polish priest in the middle of Nowheresville, Poland, is like, yeah, come on in. Let me show you where to go. And he moves the pulpit out of the way, and there was like a little trap door, and he has him go down there. And it's like, no kid allowing a Catholic priest to walk them into a little dungeon under a pulpit's ever had any questions, right? But apparently this was an okay thing. So he goes down there, and there's bread, there's cheese, there's water, there's supplies. There's also another small Jewish boy down there who is also a survivor from maybe another death march. Priest explains, this boy is under my protection as well. Stay quiet. He'll whisper to you what you need to do to stay down here and not be found. He's like, don't ever try to come out unless you need to. And he's like, if you need to go to the bathroom, you have a pot and everything over on the side. Like, just, this is the way it works for now. Okay, sure. Priest goes back up, closes the place, and they're just under like a small match light of a candle. Well, they hear some commotion upstairs not long after they get hidden and tucked away. Apparently, the Germans that were a part of that march also found the village, and now they're not trying to find the boy. They're just trying to find anything they can in terms of supplies so that they can keep moving. So while they go up to the priest, they're like, give us everything you got. He's like, I have nothing. So they try to get the collections. They try to get every gold crucifix that isn't bolted down, and they're beating the crap out of the priest. He takes this beating like you wouldn't believe, but he lives, and they basically rob him and leave. He still gives it a little while until the Russians get into the town before he goes and checks on the boys. But then the Russians take over the town. Everything seems like it's going to be better. And so he goes and checks down on them. And when he goes to see them, his nose is broken, face has a bunch of lacerations. He got beaten. But he feeds the boys and he gives them a little bit of hope in the form of, I think this is the end. And before long, the war was declared over. Things seemed like they were going to be fixed. And a few weeks later, the priest is sending these boys packing into whatever direction they need to go to try and find family. Now, at this point in the story, David Tenenbaum is like 15, 16 years old. He's not quite able to fend for himself, although kids in that era were doing that and more. He decides that he's going to go east towards Russia because he has family that are in Russia. And he doesn't make it quite that deep into the motherland before he finds some far-flung relatives, and he stays with them until he's about 18. He only stays with them long enough to accrue a decent enough amount of a nest egg to then make the journey to New York. And he ends up staying in New York from, I believe, the early 50s until the mid 1980s. And this is an important part of the story, because during that entire time, he's pretty much a shut-in. He doesn't do anything like go out and hang out at the local bar.
Just keeps to himself.
Very much. And he owns his own little library bookstore. And so as he runs this little bookstore in New York, keeps to himself, he doesn't even read like the local paper, the national paper. He doesn't own a television. So in terms of his ability to know what's going on in the world, I'm not going to say it's zero, but it's damn close to zero. So for him, having like kept to himself for almost 30 years and now being like in his 40s, just kind of aloof and not really thinking about things outside of his four walls in New York. It was impressive to him when one day he gets a letter addressed to him that isn't from, New York taxation or anything like he's used to. It's from the Vatican. And in that moment, he's like, okay, this has to be the wrong person. But he opens it up and everything is addressed to him. And apparently The priest who had found him when he was a little boy would like to reconnect with him. And once he corresponds back to the Vatican, giving them the go ahead and some dates, they will then buy him a plane ticket, all expenses paid, send him to Rome to meet the priest. They'll put him up in a hotel. He'll have all of his accommodations covered, his food, everything. And he's like, absolutely. Even if he had to pay for it out of pocket, anything to go repay his thanks to this man who saved his life. So he corresponds back. Some time passes. He gets the plane ticket. Everything's golden. He makes the trip to Rome. When he gets off the plane, he's not greeted by just any old chauffeur. It's a bunch of cardinals. And these cardinals are going to take him around. And so it's not like you and I just showing up and our buddy picks us up in their, 1992 Geo Metro. He's in a limousine that's like up armored, bulletproof glass, the whole nine, being ushered around by cardinals from the Catholic Church. And I get it. He's a Holocaust survivor. This is a big deal. But, it still hasn't like set into him that he's on this all expense paid trip by the Vatican to go see this priest, and it's going to be a big deal. But he goes around and eventually he goes to the Vatican City. And when he's in one of the main atriums, the cardinals like break away from him and he starts walking by, and all of a sudden everyone bows their head because now the Pope walks in. And so as the Pope turns the corner, David Tenenbaum just knows, oh, this is the Pope. Okay, so he like bows his head and then he looks at the man and he really registers. Pope John Paul was the young Polish priest who had saved him as a kid. It was Pope John Paul. So this whole time, he had no clue who the Pope was. He just knows there is a Pope. He didn't think anything of it being that guy. And so they have this beautiful time together. They reconnect. And during this point was when Pope John Paul was asking, do you have a family? And he's like, no, well, my family died. And he's like, no. What I mean is, did you start a family? And he's like, no, I just don't have the desire. And he's like, why don't you have the desire? He's like, it's just not in my DNA. I just never wanted a family. And then when this happened and I lost mine, it was so gut wrenching. I just never wanted to be in that situation where someone could lose a family. So I just decided not to start one. And Pope John Paul throws down the gauntlet. And he's like, for nothing other than spite against the Nazis, you should have the biggest family of all time. You should go and you should procreate and you should make the biggest, middle finger you can to the Holocaust. And so kind of late in life, David Tenenbaum finds love, finds a woman, and starts a family because the Pope told him to. It's like, why wouldn't you? Because that really is the ultimate win. Surviving wasn't something that he had to do. He found like he wanted to survive. And then after that, or actually, I don't want to say want, he needed to survive. And then he felt like he didn't need to have a family. And because it felt like a want, he didn't want to, he didn't realize that Pope was telling him, no, this is a need. You need to, because they tried to snuff out a bloodline, and they did for many families. So for them, you do it for them. And so probably the coolest story I've ever heard in my life. I've never thought of any situation where the confluence of events could have been so perfect with such key players involved and be so poetic. One of only two survivors of an entire death camp, one of the worst of all time, not only survives, but survives at the hands of a man who would one day go on to be the Pope of the Catholic Church. Not just a Pope, some would argue the Pope, right? Like Pope John Paul was once attempted assassination attempt, right? An assassination attempt was made against Pope John Paul, and he forgave the assassin. Like, he's that guy. So why shouldn't we be that surprised that he was fighting Nazis too? Like, man, pretty hard to imagine someone cooler than Pope John Paul. And I'm not even religious. I just think he's cool. Now, towards the end of that class with Professor O'Gara, we had to do some presentations. And I remember I did my presentation on Majdanek, which was one of the camps. And as I'm doing like the math on how long it was in operation, how many poor souls had to go through there, and what all came of it, and the history and how it came down, and the emancipation of the people from that camp. I didn't think twice when I showed up to my final class because we always had people coming in and observing classes, whether it was just people that were seeing if it was a class they wanted to take for the next semester, or whether they were, studying as adjunct professors and they were watching the main professor. So I didn't think anything of it when the final presentation date came along and they were like, "Oh, come on in." And we had two people in the back, an older gentleman and a younger lady. Well, after all of the presentations, Professor O'Gara was like, "David, what'd you think?" And now my name's David. So I'm like, I don't think he's asking the student David. I'm like, who else is here? I know all 9 of my other classmates at this point. Oh, he's talking to the other guy. And this old man gets up, comes to the front. He's like, "This was a wonderful class. Thank you guys so much. It was beautiful hearing your presentations. And thank you for taking the time to learn about a very dark part of history that we still have people who deny happened." And, he's going through this tirade on how he feels about this presentation. And all of a sudden it's clicking. This is David Tenenbaum. Like, we get to meet this person. Now, this was the early 2000s. And I wouldn't say he was venerable, but he was older. And the gal who was with him was actually his daughter. And it was cool because, he ended up having this late life child and she came with him, and it was this beautiful experience. So I got to meet a piece of history. He has subsequently passed away. He passed away of old age, but it was still great. Even a few years ago when I heard of his passing, I was like, man, how crazy is it to think like he made it into the 21st century as a Holocaust survivor, started a family late in life, kind of as like a middle finger to the Nazis, and can say, yeah, you might be tough, but are you so tough you survived the hardest death camp of all time? And then it's like, what'd you do to show for it? Opened a bookstore. It's pretty gangster. Anyway, that's the story of David Tenenbaum. Yeah, pretty wild.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to start with it, because it's a really good story.
Yeah, but the survivor story is probably one of the craziest stories we can think of. When you think of like, what was it, 127 Hours? The documentary that James Franco did about the guy who was in the rock climbing incident where he fell into a crevasse and the boulder caught his arm and he was stuck down there for, days, and he eventually had to cut through his own arm to get out. When I think of stories of survival like that, that's very impressive because for me, having been a survivor of, domestic abuse, things as a child, and then having to ultimately like get away from my home situation, make it on my own, be homeless for a while, get back into school. I have nothing against a great, wholesome family. When I see like the Leave It to Beaver crowd, I'm like, good on you folks. I'm not jealous. I'm not mad. I wish more people had that. I don't want anybody to play life on hard mode. But when I hear of somebody who has an incredible tale of, survivalism, they found a way. It's near and dear to me because that's what I think is a core side of my being, which is you find a way. You adapt, you overcome, and you don't have a pity party. You just know that things are tough, but you got to make it through. What are you going to do? Accept defeat and just, become a hashtag on a t-shirt? No, you got to let yourself grow from the stress and get out of it. So I don't want to get into the specifics of what David Tenenbaum went through, but he gave us some rundowns on the things he encountered and the state of things, and it's even worse than we can imagine.